Good morning, everyone. My name is Andrew Ross Sorkin of CNBC and the New York Times, and it is my pleasure to have the finance minister here of India at a very important time in the world and an important time for India, really at perhaps an inflection point, which feels like an inflection point. We will find out how much of an inflection point. So first of all, thank you for being here. I think the big question, just to start with, is this is a country, there are very high expectations now that have been set into motion. There was a time that this country had GDP of 9%. Realistically, over the next 2 or 3 years, what do you think is a realistic GDP number? Where do you think the country's economy could really go?
Well, I think our real potential is 9% plus. And therefore, we'd like to take India in that direction. We've had problems and challenges. We went below 5%, which by Indian standards is a very disappointing rate. Hopefully, we'll do a little better this year. Next year, I think, is going to be significantly better. And if we can continue to take decisions at the pace we are and eventually attract investment into India, I think then India is going to move much faster. And achieving our real potential will then appear to be more realistic.
Let me read you something. This is from The Economist magazine. It says that when Modi first won, hopes swelled that the new government would adopt economic reforms that had proved beyond the brittle coalitions of the past. Yet in defiance of the maxim that bold steps are best taken early, he has so far not had dramatic change. So cuts to subsidies such as fuel and fertilizers, which cost GDP 2.3% last year, have been deferred. There's no firm timetable, the article says, for a national goods and services tax. India's many states' caps on foreign direct investment in many areas, including supermarkets, remain in place. And the question that the article asks is the chance to reshape India's economy slipping away already? I ask it to be provocative.
I think you've picked up an economist which must have been a July dateline. So that's not in tune with what's happened. That's not in tune with what's happened in the last 6-8 months. Now, what is to be done in a large country like India, almost the size of a continent, with the goods and services tax? We've negotiated with the states. A constitutional amendment bill has already been introduced in Parliament. It's been broadly welcomed. And in the coming session of Parliament next month, I hope to pass that bill. So that's going to be one of the most monumental tax reforms in India since independence. I was asking last evening the secretary of the department which deals with the FDI, he's here. I asked him a question, which are the sectors which are broadly still unreformed as far as attracting international investment is concerned? He's still struggling to prepare a list. And therefore, sectors which were the forbidden areas in India, railways, defense, in the last few months, we've opened up those sectors also.
How much of a boost did the declining oil prices have on the economy?
Well, the declining oil prices certainly help us in many, many areas. They help us in cutting down subsidies. They help us in our current account deficits. And of course, they help us in bringing down inflation, which we have succeeded. And in India, it's not merely the declining oil prices or the declining commodity prices. Our food prices have also been under control, as a result of which we've been able to maintain a fairly acceptable rate as far as inflation is concerned. Of course, there are areas where they vicariously hurt us, but we are willing to live with them. For instance, most states in India are losing out on revenues, and therefore the regions are a little disturbed, but then they have to live with this realistic situation because the advantages are a bit too many.
You're going to announce a budget, I believe, in the next 2 weeks, and you have to pay for a lot of things that you've talked about and promised the people. How do you pay for it?
Well, we earn and spend. We've also had a bad tradition of borrowing and spending. And therefore, since last year, we've raised this debate. In fact, I said it in my first budget speech that how long can India continue to borrow and spend so that we spend today that the next generation is left in debt and they have to raise higher taxes in order to repay that debt. And that is where we started this whole debate on cutting down of or rationalizing the subsidies. I can tell you, elimination of subsidies in India, a country where 1/3 of the people are still living in poverty conditions, is not possible. It's not even desirable. In fact, the more India grows, the more we have to earn in order to bring those people, pull them out of poverty. But we have to rationalize our subsidies. We not only started a debate, and since that was a line from The Economist that you mentioned, petrol is now linked to the market, which was subsidized. Diesel has been linked to the market. As far as LPG is concerned, the first subsidy reform has started this month. From the 1st of January, all subsidies with regard to cooking gas now go directly into the bank accounts. So almost 150 million families in India will get them. The next stage, we have to carve out the families who are not entitled to it. And therefore, that will be the reform as far as the cooking gas is concerned. There are, of course, areas where there is a misuse of kerosene subsidy. Kerosene is used both as fuel and also in dark areas in India. But kerosene is also being misused in many areas. So the next area we intend tackling is kerosene. I had appointed in the very first month an expenditure management commission. They've only 3 days ago given me the interim report with regard to rationalizing some of these subsidies. The Prime Minister last week in a major address on economic issues had said, subsidies for the poor will remain, but we intend rationalizing them. And that's the area where we intend to move in order to cut down some part of the expenditure in order to finance our own activities. We have targeted a fiscal deficit of 4.1%, but that's not also acceptable as far as we are concerned. We have a roadmap to bring it down to below 3% over the next couple of years, and we intend to maintain those targets.
What about taxes?
Well, we've said that we are not a high tax government. And therefore, last year, I almost didn't increase a single tax. We believe in putting more money into the hands of consumers. Therefore, there were 3 sets of reliefs that I had given in the very first interim budget to small and medium level taxpayers so that they could spend more. We look at taxes, we are correcting the inverted taxation, which can hurt certain sections of the industry. But of course, taxes are needed in order to finance the running of the government.
Let me ask you about corruption. I walked over here on my way to visit with you this morning with the CEO of a multinational company who does business in your country, who's in the middle of building several projects. And he said to me that we just went through the process of 170 different permits to do this. And he said, along the way, amidst those 170 permits, I am sure that we have had to pay people and do things that he said, I wish I don't even know about. Whether he does or not, I don't know. How big a problem do you think this is in reality?
Well, I can't say that this was not a problem, but let the CEO of the multinational not commit the same mistake as The Economist. Because if in last 8 months, there's one word which has not been mentioned in India, that's corruption. Nobody's even whispered that there is any allegation as far as corruption is concerned. The whole environment is changed. In fact, every legislative change which we are bringing, whether it's allocation of natural resources, elimination of discretions, grant of environmental permissions which are required, these are almost in the most non-discretionary mechanism. All allocations are through a market mechanism. There's certainly no governmental discretion which is involved. And a major part of the corruption which was alleged against the previous government was in these allocations. So it's the whole system which is now changing.
You've been here now in Davos. You have a huge contingent of people here. I know you're looking for more foreign direct investment. What are the biggest challenges that you hear multinationals saying to you about investing in the country?
Well, we have legacy issues. And in terms of legacy issues, I think the two important legacy issues which we have, one is in relation to stability of policy, particularly taxation. We didn't exactly have the best track record in that. And I think a very adversarial tax policy was counterproductive for India. It scared investment away. Now, we've spent a major part of the last 8 months trying to correct that impression. And therefore, systematically, slowly but surely, we are reversing the whole policy and coming to a very non-adversarial system. We've announced that we are not going to resort to the sovereign power of retrospective taxation. We are trying to put a quietus to as many disputes and issues which had arisen. We are setting up mechanisms within the Department of Revenue where a lot of these issues could be resolved. We are creating procedures both for international and domestic investors for advance rulings so they know what their tax liabilities are going to be even before they spend the first dollar. I think we are conscious of this fact. The second fact, we have to ease in the doing of business in India. The less number of people come to government, that means situation is working well, things are happening on their own. And we don't want people to be rushing to ministerial offices or secretaries for help, that their files or their papers are blocked somewhere. We want to create a mechanism where permission should be granted as at the earliest. In this process, we are also trying to solicit the support of the state governments, particularly because the activity is really in the states. And the activity being in the states, it's the states which have to realize that the more they make their procedures simpler, the more they are going to attract and invite investment into their states. And I'm glad, we traditionally used to speak of India in terms of cooperative federalism. We've added a new chapter to that debate by saying that it's also competitive federalism. He who makes his procedures simpler will get more money from the investors. So the investors are not going to go into a complicated area, they're going to go into a rather simpler area. And I'm quite glad that state after state is now trying to organize these global summits of investors, trying to invite them into their states, trying to offer them additional incentives. Once we are able to create this environment in India, I think the procedures will become simpler.
Okay. I want you to speak to one other challenge, if you will, and then I want to open it up to the audience, which is a social issue, but it is something that business people think about a lot, which is sexual violence against women has been a huge issue in the country. What are you doing about it? What do you think it is about the culture? Why do you think the problem exists the way it does?
In fact, the Prime Minister, in one of his first major speeches after being elected, that's the Independence Day speech, referred to it as a major point. A lot of people felt that this wasn't a point worth mentioning as an Independence Day speech. And he said, my head hangs in shape when I read about these incidents which are happening. And the regrettable part is it's the male members of our own families who are responsible for this behavior. Even during the tenure of the last government, we had been jointly, unanimously able to strengthen laws. But I'm quite conscious of the fact that laws alone are not going to resolve this problem. There has to be a campaign of disgust against this kind of a behavior, so that from the very elementary education, people can be trained, educated, almost indoctrinated against this culture of misdemeanors against women of various kinds. And I'm sure it'll have to be a sustained campaign in India before we are able to rid ourselves of this disgraceful scar on our face.
I would just follow up with a specific question which relates to this story about Uber, which is that you have Uber, the taxi limousine service, which you have shut down in part because there was an awful, tragic incident related to this. Do you ever think, do you connect corporate behavior with personal behavior?
I don't think they were shut down because of that incident. There were certain permissions which were required in some states, and they've been asked to comply with the procedures. The person who was accused of that offense, the police investigation has now revealed that he was a serial offender. And therefore, that serial offender was there even before he was a part of this company. So I think the company's service in some of the states was affected for some time because they required some permissions. But whether this person was misbehaving because he was a company employee, I really can't say that.
Honorable Minister, there was a lot of discussion on encouraging manufacturing in India, and for exports. So I was very curious to know your views on MAT and how you see that perhaps being lowered, or what your view is on that, and maybe how that could also encourage and incentivize and encourage more manufacturing in India. Thank you.
Certainly, if I was in a position to get rid of MAT, as many people, particularly in the SEZs, etc., are also been saying, it'll help you in lowering the cost. But then I also have a problem of balancing my budget. I can't reduce MAT and then increase income tax, because the money has to come from somewhere. And therefore, till such time, we are not in a position to balance our accounts. For any finance minister to give, withdraw this tax or withdraw this tax is not so easily possible. In the current year, I may just indicate, we made a significant progress as far as our direct taxes are concerned. But when you have a low on manufacturing, the manufacturing taxes collection has suffered. And therefore, it's a great challenge for us to balance our budgets. So unless we are in a position to up the manufacturing so that my overall tax kitty moves up, it's not so easy for any finance minister to then start offering rebates.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. Nelson Cunningham with McClarty Associates in Washington, D.C. Mr. Modi has really made a substantial effort to turn the page on what had been a period of somewhat scratchy relations between India and the United States. He had a very successful visit to Washington last fall. He's invited President Obama to India for Republic Day this coming Monday. What is Mr. Modi's vision, your vision, for the relationship between India and the United States, and what outcomes can investors expect from the meetings that will happen on Monday?
Well, there is a packed agenda as far as Monday is concerned. But I can tell you, I won't describe it as a patchy or a scratchy relationship. Over the last decade and a half, the Indo-US relationship has fairly well stabilized. When we were in government on the last occasion, the relationship, the building process of that relationship had started. And the last UPA government continued to build upon those initial gains that we had. The advantage of having two major democracies and two large nations in a continuous relationship is that the relationship has matured to an extent that even though we may have differences in some areas, it's not possible to agree on everything. The maturity of the relationship is visible, that you still can sustain that comfortable level in a relationship. The fact that President Obama is visiting India for a second time in his term, it's the first time that a US president has come to India twice. He's going to be our chief guest on our Republic Day, the first American president to be so. And by negotiation, we are narrowing down the areas of differences and expand the areas of cooperation. So I think it's the relationship between India and the United States being a relationship of two very large democracies, as I mentioned, is a relationship around economic and security issues. And it's in these areas that the roadmap for the future of this relationship really lies.
Let me follow up and complicate the question. Putin really recently visited New Delhi. How would you describe the relationship between India and Russia?
Well, I think India and Russia have been always great friends. And therefore, I see absolutely no contradiction in a country being extremely friendly across the globe with multiple nations. Through historical times and through even our most difficult times, India and Russia have had a great relationship. Russians have stood by us in our critical times, and I think irrespective of the color or complexion of the government in India, that relationship has been maintained. We were at one stage very dependent on the Russians for our defense equipment and so on. Today it's a much broader basket, but that relationship still continues.
The other thing we could talk about is immigration policy. And one of the questions that I had for you, oddly enough, is what you think of the immigration policy of the United States vis-a-vis so many of the people who are coming from India's top talent network to work overseas.
Well, we've always believed, both in our bilateral relationship and in the multilateral forums, that this is one area where the United States has to open up more. Because human resource traveling from one part of the world to another is a very important segment of the services sector. And therefore, the more we are able to restrict them, the more our ability to expand both trade and services gets restrictive. The United States has conventionally been a great supporter of the idea of opening out in various areas. And therefore, in consonance with that idea, I think, subject to what their own requirements are, the immigration policy, we'd like it to be liberal. We like more Indians everywhere in the world.
Let me ask you a different question. When you got this job and you started looking at other countries, when you started looking at other countries, perhaps, I don't know if you did this, as models, who do you look at right now and go, you know what? I like what they're doing on this issue. I like what they're doing on this issue. I'm just curious, because I assume when you get a job like this, you start thinking.
When you get a job, you see, in India, we've always look at the last few decades of missed opportunities, particularly in manufacturing. And therefore, India is a liberal society. We are willing to learn from anywhere in the world. And when you look at manufacturing, a question which every Indian asks himself, what if we had started adopting some of these policies in the 1970s? Would we have kept pace with China as far as manufacturing is concerned? Today, foremost on the agenda, and that's one of the questions with regard to Matt, which was asked just now, the real answer is we have to learn from economies like that how to improve our core competence as far as low-cost manufacturing is concerned. One of the components may be taxation, but there are several other components which we have to really learn from their experiences. We have to learn from economies which pass through challenging moments, but disciplined themselves, didn't go in for only populism, and within a year or two got out of those crisis situations so that in the long term there was a much greater advantage as far as the country is concerned. Britain did it recently in the last few years, and I think we have to learn from that. How to generate wealth and then let that be scattered between your people rather than just distribute existing resources to the people. We have to look up to economies like the United States. And I think Indians, when I mentioned in the last question, travel all over the world and become parts of those societies. Indians in India are very entrepreneurial. They want to learn from the best experiments in the world. I think this is what we are really looking at.
You've inspired some more questions. We're going to have to cut it off in a second. Now they're giving me the timeline. But why don't we go here?
Vivian Reifberg with McKinsey & Company in Washington, D.C. If we go back to the discussions with the U.S., what is the one thing that you want to most see change?
Well, as I said, economic and security issues are foremost in our mind. I think our economic relationships have been progressing well. We are also concerned about our region. And our region throws up challenging situations, particularly with regard to security. And we'd like a much greater understanding with the United States with regard to the regional issues as far as India and the region is concerned.
My name is Adib Ahmed. My question is on an financial sector. It's actually twofolds. The first fold is that recently there has been an announcement, and of course the spirit is very high for the NRIs to actually invest back in India. So the first question is about the recent licensing procedure on a small bank that recently came up. But we were very surprised to see that there was a restriction on NRI investment on the sector because 51% needs to be resident Indian ownership companies. On the second fold of my question is, at the junction now where there is a lot of need for investment in infrastructure, there has been a cap on investment in banks in India, which restrict to on an individual capacity is around 4.99%. Is there a possibility that this limit would be increased?
Well, on the eve of the budget, I won't give you an answer in yes or no, but I'll take your question as a suggestion.